Something has felt off lately. Not dramatic. Not catastrophic. Just off. You wake up tired, even after sleeping. Your mind feels louder than usual. Small problems feel heavier than they should. Things that normally wouldn't shake you now linger longer than they should. You try to brush it off. Maybe I'm just stressed. Maybe I need a break. Maybe I'm overthinking. But deep down, you know this feels different. It's not just busyness. It's not just responsibility. It feels like pressure. Invisible pressure. Like something is pushing against you, but you can't see what it is. You try to pray, and it feels harder. You try to focus, and your thoughts scatter. You try to stay positive, but doubt keeps creeping in. And the strangest part? Nothing catastrophic has even happened. Yet internally, it feels like you're fighting something. Have you noticed that? Moments when clarity was starting to form in your life, and suddenly confusion increased? Moments when you were about to make progress, and suddenly resistance intensified? Moments when you finally felt motivated, and suddenly discouragement showed up out of nowhere? It's subtle, but it's real. You feel more irritated than usual, more tempted than usual, more doubtful than usual, more isolated than usual. It's like your emotional stability has been nudged slightly off-center, and you can't explain why. Let me ask you something honestly. What if this isn't random? What if the sudden heaviness, the unexpected doubts, the internal pressure isn't just psychological? What if it's resistance? Because here's what many people don't realize. The most intense battles in your life rarely begin around you. They begin within you. Not with explosions, but with whispers. Not with obvious chaos, but with subtle distortion. A thought planted, a doubt magnified, an insecurity replayed. And if you're not paying attention, you start believing those thoughts are yours. You start assuming the fatigue is weakness. You start interpreting the pressure as failure. But what if pressure doesn't mean you're failing? What if pressure means you're moving? What if the reason things feel heavier lately is because something about your life is shifting? There are seasons when you're just living, and there are seasons when you're advancing. Advancement attracts resistance. Growth attracts friction. Purpose attracts opposition. You don't experience resistance because you're irrelevant. You experience resistance because you matter. And most spiritual warfare does not look like horror movies. It looks like overthinking at 2 a.m., sudden identity doubt, losing confidence you just built, feeling like quitting something you once felt called to. It looks like internal pressure. If you felt like something has been pressing against your peace lately, you're not crazy. If you felt like discouragement increased the moment you tried to grow, you're not weak. If you felt like the battle moved into your mind, you're not imagining it. Sometimes the shift you're sensing isn't anxiety. It's opposition. And opposition doesn't show up when you're stagnant. It shows up when you're stepping forward. Before breakthrough, there is often pressure. Before clarity, there is often confusion. Before elevation, there is often resistance. So instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" maybe the better question is, "What is trying to stop me?" Because sometimes the reason something feels off is because something is shifting. And when something shifts, friction follows. This isn't about paranoia. This isn't about blaming everything on spiritual forces. This is about recognizing patterns. Because if the battle has intensified in your thoughts, if your confidence has been targeted, if your peace has been challenged, then maybe this isn't random. Maybe this is a sign that you are not as passive as you think. Maybe your growth has triggered resistance. Maybe your future has attracted friction. And maybe the pressure you feel right now is proof that you're closer to something than you realize. Let's talk about that pattern. Because once you see it, you'll never interpret pressure the same way again. If you step back and look at your life like a story instead of a series of random bad days, you'll notice something strange. There's a pattern. The pressure doesn't usually come when you're drifting. It doesn't spike when you're numb, distracted, or spiritually asleep. It increases when you start moving. When you pray more seriously. When you decide to forgive. When you try to discipline your thoughts. When you finally say, "I'm done living small." That's when the resistance shows up. It's almost predictable. You decide to pursue healing. Suddenly, old wounds resurface. You commit to consistency. Suddenly exhaustion hits harder. You begin reading scripture daily. Suddenly distraction multiplies. You start believing God might use you. Suddenly insecurity screams. That's not coincidence. Throughout scripture, breakthrough is almost always preceded by pressure. Before freedom, there is confrontation. Before elevation, there is testing. Before clarity, there is confusion. Think about it. Joseph received the dream before the pit. David was anointed before he was hunted. Jesus was baptized before he was tempted. There is a pattern, calling confirmation confrontation. And most people quit in the confrontation stage because they assume pressure means disqualification. But what if pressure is actually confirmation? What if the resistance you're feeling is evidence that you've stepped into territory that matters? When you're walking in circles, the enemy doesn't need to stop you. You're already stalled. But when you start walking toward purpose, when your habits begin to shift, when your thinking begins to change, that's when opposition intensifies. Pressure increases before breakthrough because growth disrupts something. It disrupts cycles. It disrupts generational patterns. It disrupts spiritual stagnation. And disruption attracts resistance. Look at the rhythm of nature. Before a storm clears the sky, winds intensify. Before birth, labor pains increase. Before a seed breaks through the soil, it experiences crushing darkness underground. Pressure is not always a sign of collapse. Sometimes it is the force required for emergence. The problem is that pressure feels like loss while you're inside it. It feels like God stepped back. It feels like momentum disappeared. It feels like you misheard him. But the pattern says otherwise. The pattern says pressure often signals proximity. The closer you get to something significant, the more friction you encounter. Not because you're failing, but because you're approaching. There's also a psychological dimension to this. When you grow spiritually, your internal landscape shifts. Old coping mechanisms lose their grip. Your identity begins to detach from comfort zones. Your mind, which was used to familiar narratives, suddenly has to adjust. And your brain resists change. Spiritual growth feels like instability at first because your old identity is being dismantled. So some of what feels like attack is actually transition. But here's where it gets deeper. There is a difference between normal life stress and targeted spiritual opposition. Normal stress drains you. Spiritual pressure attempts to distort you. It attacks clarity. It amplifies fear. It magnifies lies. It isolates you. And it often happens right before momentum. Have you noticed that right before you're about to do something meaningful, something tries to discourage you? Right before you post that message. Right before you commit to that new discipline. Right before you speak up. Right before you forgive. Right before you level up. Doubt suddenly spikes. That is not random timing. There is a spiritual intelligence that understands timing. And it often attacks not your present, but your potential. You don't face unusual resistance because you're weak. You face unusual resistance because you're shifting. Breakthrough disrupts territory. And territory doesn't get surrendered quietly. But here's the danger. If you misinterpret pressure as abandonment, you will retreat right before transformation. The enemy doesn't need to destroy you. He just needs you to misread the season. If he can convince you that pressure equals punishment, you'll walk away voluntarily. And that's the strategy. Misinterpretation. You'll say, I must have done something wrong. Maybe I'm not called. Maybe this isn't for me. And you'll quit right before clarity. But look again at the pattern. Pressure rises. Confusion intensifies. Doubt whispers. Fatigue increases. And then, breakthrough. Not always instantly. Not always dramatically. But consistently. There is a strange law of spiritual momentum. Resistance spikes before release. Think about how weightlifting works. The muscle only grows after tension. The resistance is not a sign you should drop the weight. It's the reason growth is happening. Spiritually, tension works the same way. The weight you feel might be the very force shaping you. And here's something else. Pressure exposes what's inside you. It reveals what you truly believe. It reveals your thought patterns. It reveals whether your faith is anchored or emotional. Breakthrough doesn't just change your situation, it changes your structure. So before the door opens externally, something has to strengthen internally. That strengthening often feels like attack, because strengthening requires resistance. And if you zoom out far enough, you'll see that many of your hardest seasons preceded your biggest growth shifts. The heartbreak before maturity, the isolation before clarity, the failure before direction, the silence before depth. Pressure has a history in your life, and it has never had the final word. So if you feel spiritually attacked lately, ask yourself, did I recently start moving? Did I recently decide to grow? Did I recently commit to something deeper? Because the pattern suggests something powerful. Pressure doesn't always mean something is wrong. It often means something is about to change. And if you understand the pattern, you won't panic in the process. You'll brace. You'll stabilize. You'll say, I've seen this before. And instead of retreating, you'll stand. Because breakthrough isn't random, and neither is resistance. This is not chaos. This is a pattern, and patterns mean purpose. If the attack were physical, it would be easier to recognize. If it were visible, you could point to it. If it were external, you could fight it directly. If it were loud, you could name it. But this battle doesn't usually start outside of you. It starts in your thoughts. That's why it's so exhausting. The battlefield is not your job, not your relationships, not your bank account, not even your circumstances. The battlefield is your mind. Because if your mind can be destabilized, everything else eventually follows. You can be blessed externally and tormented internally. You can be progressing publicly and doubting privately. You can be surrounded by people and still feel isolated in your own head. And that's where spiritual warfare often hides, in the realm of thoughts that sound like your own voice. It doesn't usually say, this is an attack. It says, you're falling behind. You're not good enough. This won't work. You always mess things up. God is disappointed. You've already failed. The tone feels familiar, but the origin isn't always yours. Here's what makes the mind such strategic territory. Your thoughts shape your perception. Your perception shapes your emotions. Your emotions shape your decisions. Your decisions shape your direction. So if your thoughts are compromised, your trajectory shifts without you even realizing it. You don't need chains around your body if your thinking is already bound. That's why the enemy targets narrative. Not your possessions. Not your status. Your narrative. If he can alter the story you're telling yourself, he can redirect your future. Notice how subtle it is. It rarely begins with dramatic fear. It begins with small distortions. A minor insecurity becomes identity. A temporary delay becomes permanent failure. A mistake becomes a label. A quiet season becomes abandonment. Distortion is the weapon. And distortion works best in isolation. When you're tired. When you're overwhelmed. When you're emotionally drained. When you haven't been guarding your inputs. The mind becomes more vulnerable when it's fatigued. That's why spiritual pressure often feels mental before it feels circumstantial. You start overthinking. You replay conversations. You anticipate worst-case scenarios. You assume rejection. You imagine outcomes that haven't happened. And your body responds as if the threat is real. Anxiety increases. Rest disappears. Focus fragments. But the battlefield is not your future. It's your interpretation. Let's be clear. Not every negative thought is spiritual warfare. You are human. You have stress. You have biology. You have past experiences that shape your reactions. But spiritual attack amplifies. It doesn't just suggest doubt, it intensifies it. It doesn't just bring fear, it magnifies it. It doesn't just whisper insecurity, it repeats it until it feels factual. The key difference is persistence and distortion. It keeps pushing the same narrative, even when evidence contradicts it. You may be progressing, but the voice says you're regressing. You may be loved, but the voice says you're alone. You may be called, but the voice says you're incapable. And the longer that voice goes unchallenged, the more it feels like truth. That's why Scripture talks so much about renewing the mind. Because transformation doesn't begin with behavior. It begins with thought patterns. If your mind is renewed, your reactions change. If your reactions change, your habits change. If your habits change, your life changes. So the enemy doesn't need to destroy your destiny directly. He just needs to plant thoughts that slowly disconnect you from it. Here's another layer. Spiritual warfare in the mind often attacks identity before action. It tries to convince you of who you are not. You're not disciplined. You're not chosen. You're not strong. You're not consistent. You're not spiritually mature. Because once identity is weakened, behavior follows. If you believe you are inconsistent, you'll stop trying. If you believe you're spiritually weak, you'll avoid prayer. If you believe you're unqualified, you'll shrink back. Identity is leverage. That's why so many attacks feel personal. They target your sense of self. And here's the most dangerous part. The mind is quiet. No one sees this war. People see your smile. They see your productivity. They see your posts. They see your schedule. They don't see the internal arguments. They don't see the mental exhaustion. They don't see the spiritual pressure. They don't see the invisible resistance. And because it's invisible, you start questioning yourself. Why am I thinking like this? Why can't I shut this off? Why does this feel so heavy? But heaviness doesn't mean you're losing. It means you're in a battle. And battles require awareness. If you don't know where the war is happening, you'll fight in the wrong place. You'll try to fix your schedule instead of your thoughts. You'll try to change your environment instead of your narrative. You'll try to escape instead of confront. But the battlefield is internal, which means the weapons must be internal too. Truth, clarity, intentional thought correction, spiritual discipline, guarded inputs. Because whatever repeatedly enters your mind eventually shapes it. What you watch, what you listen to, who you confide in, what you rehearse mentally, all of it builds mental architecture. And spiritual warfare often exploits unguarded gates. It feeds on comparison. It feeds on negativity. It feeds on unresolved pain. If your mind is constantly consuming fear-based content, fear becomes easier to trigger. If your mind is constantly comparing, insecurity becomes easier to awaken. Guarding your mind is not weakness. It's strategy. Because when your mind is stable, attacks lose power. Think about this. You don't lose battles because you're attacked. You lose battles when you believe the wrong narrative. The mind is where surrender begins, or resistance strengthens. So when pressure increases and your thoughts feel chaotic, don't automatically assume you're failing. Pause. Observe your internal dialogue. Ask, what story am I believing right now? Who does this narrative benefit? Is this thought aligned with truth or distortion? You don't have to accept every thought that enters your head. Not every thought deserves agreement. Some thoughts are invitations, and you choose whether to RSVP. Spiritual maturity isn't the absence of intrusive thoughts. It's the discipline to challenge them. It's the ability to say, that's fear talking. That's distortion. That's not aligned with who I'm becoming. Because you are not powerless in this war. The battlefield may be your mind, but your mind is not defenseless. And once you realize where the war is happening, you stop fighting shadows. You start guarding territory. And when your mind stabilizes, the pressure loses its grip. Because the war was never about your circumstances. It was about your perspective. And perspective, when anchored in truth, becomes a weapon. Let's be real for a second. Not everything is spiritual warfare. Sometimes you're just tired. Sometimes you're overloaded. Sometimes you didn't sleep enough, drank too much caffeine, and now your nervous system is staging a protest. We're human. Stress is normal. But there are moments when what you're experiencing goes beyond ordinary stress. It feels targeted, timed, intensified, almost strategic. And if you don't discern the difference, you'll treat a spiritual battle like a productivity problem. Here are some signs the pressure might be more than just a rough week. 1. The attack targets your identity, not just your circumstances. Stress says, this situation is hard. Spiritual attack says, you are inadequate. See the difference? Normal stress challenges your schedule. Spiritual attack challenges your worth. It shifts from, this is difficult, to, you can't handle this. It moves from, that didn't work, to, you never get things right. When the narrative consistently attacks who you are, your calling, your character, your capacity, that's not random negativity. That's identity warfare. And identity is high-value territory. 2. The timing is suspicious. You decide to fast. Suddenly chaos erupts. You commit to consistency. Suddenly motivation evaporates. You begin healing. Suddenly old memories resurface intensely. You step toward opportunity. Suddenly fear spikes aggressively. It's not that stress disappears when you grow. It's that resistance often increases when you step into alignment. If the pressure consistently intensifies right after spiritual progress, pay attention. Breakthrough and opposition often travel together. 3. Isolation feels amplified. One of the clearest signs of spiritual pressure is a strong pull toward isolation. Not healthy solitude. Isolation. You feel misunderstood. You withdraw. You stop sharing. You assume people won't understand. You avoid accountability. Stress makes you tired. Spiritual attack tries to separate you. Because isolation magnifies distortion. When you're alone too long with anxious thoughts, they grow louder. And without external perspective, lies go unchallenged. If you suddenly feel the urge to disconnect from healthy support right when life feels heavy, that's a red flag. 4. You feel unusually accused. There's conviction, which leads to growth. And then there's accusation, which leads to shame. Conviction says, that behavior needs adjusting. Accusation says, you are a failure. Conviction feels firm but hopeful. Accusation feels crushing and hopeless. If your inner dialogue has shifted from correction to condemnation, that's not growth. That's an attempt to paralyze you. Shame immobilizes. Guilt corrects. Know the difference. 5. Clarity becomes foggy without logical reason. You were clear last week. Confident. Focused. Now everything feels confusing. Not because new information arrived, but because doubt amplified. You second-guess decisions you already processed. You question direction you were once confident about. You feel mentally foggy even when nothing externally changed. That sudden internal fog, that's often pressure targeting your discernment. If your clarity disappears overnight without cause, pause before assuming you made the wrong move. Sometimes clarity is attacked because it threatens stagnation. 6. Small triggers feel exaggerated. The comment wasn't that serious. The delay wasn't catastrophic. The inconvenience wasn't huge. But your reaction feels disproportionately intense. Spiritual attack often inflames emotional responses. It takes something minor and makes it feel monumental. Because if your emotions escalate, your decisions destabilize. You overreact. You withdraw. You quit prematurely. Exaggeration is a tactic. If your internal reaction feels 10x larger than the event itself, ask why. 7. You feel drained specifically around purpose. You can scroll for hours. But when it's time to pray, exhausted. When it's time to create, foggy. When it's time to work on that calling, distracted. When it's time to grow, suddenly sleepy. Notice the pattern. Energy disappears around what matters most. That's not coincidence. Spiritual resistance doesn't usually drain you randomly. It targets momentum. If fatigue consistently shows up when purpose does, that's strategic. 8. Hopelessness whispers, even when evidence says otherwise. You might objectively be doing fine. Progress is happening. Opportunities exist. Doors are opening. But internally, a quiet whisper says, it won't last. This won't work. You're behind. Something bad is coming. That persistent undertone of dread, without logical basis, often signals mental warfare. It's not based on facts. It's based on fear projection. Now here's something important. Recognizing spiritual attack is not about paranoia. It's about awareness. You don't need to see a demon behind every inconvenience. But you also shouldn't ignore patterns. Discernment sits in the middle. If multiple signs are happening at once, identity attack, suspicious timing, isolation, accusation, fog, exaggeration, purpose-specific fatigue, then you're not just having a bad week. You're likely in resistance. And here's the good news. Resistance means you matter. No one attacks territory that holds no value. Pressure reveals potential. The weight you feel may be proportionate to the impact you carry. So instead of panicking, shift your mindset. Don't ask, why is this happening to me? Ask, what is this trying to stop? Because if the opposition is strategic, then so is your calling. Here's the part most people miss. If you were insignificant to the kingdom of darkness, you would not feel strategic resistance. Nobody wastes ammunition on empty fields. Spiritual opposition is not random aggression. It's targeted disruption. And targets are chosen carefully. The pressure you feel is not proof that you're weak. It's evidence that you're dangerous. Dangerous to cycles. Dangerous to stagnation. Dangerous to generational patterns. Dangerous to lies that have quietly controlled you for years. Think about it. When you were drifting, was there this much resistance? When you were spiritually numb, did you feel this intensity? When you weren't pushing yourself, did doubt attack this aggressively? Probably not. Because passive people don't threaten anything. But growth threatens something. Awareness threatens something. Healing threatens something. You becoming disciplined, focused, and spiritually grounded, that threatens something. The attack often increases in proportion to your potential impact. And here's what makes that uncomfortable. Potential doesn't always feel powerful. It often feels fragile. When you're stepping into new territory, you don't feel strong. You feel exposed. New discipline feels shaky. New obedience feels uncertain. New habits feel awkward. So when resistance hits during that fragile stage, it feels overwhelming. But that fragility doesn't mean weakness. It means transition. A seed breaking through soil is fragile, but unstoppable. A butterfly emerging from a cocoon looks weak, but it's transforming. Your current vulnerability doesn't cancel your future strength. It confirms it's forming. Let's go deeper. Spiritual opposition rarely attacks who you were. It attacks who you are becoming. Notice that. The insecurity intensifies when you start believing you could actually do something meaningful. The fear spikes when you step toward responsibility. The discouragement grows louder when you gain traction. Why? Because becoming is disruptive. You breaking old thought patterns disrupts narratives. You refusing to quit disrupts expectations. You staying consistent disrupts cycles that assumed you'd give up. Resistance often comes not because of your past, but because of your trajectory. And trajectories matter. If someone is walking in circles, you don't need to stop them. But if someone is moving toward influence, clarity, purpose, or breakthrough, now direction becomes a problem. And here's something powerful. Attack often precedes visibility. Before elevation, there is testing. Before influence, there is refinement. Before authority, there is resistance. Because strength is built under pressure. No muscle grows without tension. No diamond forms without compression. No leader develops without opposition. The weight you're carrying right now may be strengthening you for something you haven't seen yet. And that's why it feels heavy. You are being stretched beyond your current capacity. But stretching precedes expansion. Now let's address something honest. Sometimes you interpret attack as proof that you're failing. But what if it's proof that you're advancing? What if the heaviness isn't collapse, it's growth resistance? Because when you move into deeper purpose, the standards increase. Your thinking must sharpen. Your discipline must strengthen. Your emotional maturity must deepen. Pressure prepares you for capacity. You can't carry influence with a fragile mind. You can't carry calling with unstable identity. You can't carry authority with insecurity ruling your thoughts. So resistance exposes weak areas, not to shame you, but to fortify you. The attack reveals what still needs reinforcement. And reinforcement is preparation. Here's another truth most people avoid. If you weren't capable of handling this level of pressure, you wouldn't be facing it. You are not being crushed. You are being trained. And training feels like strain before it feels like strength. Look back at previous seasons of your life. The moments that almost broke you, they built you. The rejection that hurt, it refined you. The delay that frustrated you? It matured you. The silence that confused you? It deepened you. What felt like attack often became architecture. It built internal stability. And now you stand differently because of it. So if the attack feels heavier lately, maybe it's because your assignment is expanding. Pressure scales with purpose. And here's the empowering shift. Instead of asking, why am I being attacked? Ask, what level am I stepping into? Because new levels require new resilience. And resilience doesn't grow in comfort. It grows in resistance. This doesn't mean you should romanticize struggle. You don't need to enjoy the weight. But you can reinterpret it. You can say, if there's this much resistance, there must be something valuable on the other side. And that changes everything. Because now the pressure doesn't intimidate you. It informs you. It tells you, you matter. You're moving. You're stepping into something significant. And the enemy doesn't waste effort on irrelevance. The very fact that you're being challenged mentally, spiritually, emotionally, especially when you're trying to grow, is evidence of value. You are not random. Your calling is not random. Your influence is not random. The pressure is not random. It's strategic. But so is your growth. And the attack that feels like opposition may actually be confirmation. Confirmation that you are not invisible. Confirmation that you are not powerless. Confirmation that you are not insignificant. The pressure means you matter. Now the question is, will you shrink? Or will you stand? Standing firm sounds powerful in theory. In reality, it feels quiet. It's not dramatic. It's not loud. It's not cinematic. Most of the time, standing firm looks like getting out of bed when your mind is noisy. It looks like praying when you don't feel spiritual. It looks like showing up when you feel discouraged. It looks like refusing to agree with thoughts that are screaming at you. Standing firm is rarely glamorous. It's disciplined. And when the pressure feels heavy, you don't need hype. You need structure. Because structure stabilizes you when emotions fluctuate. Here's how you stand firm when the weight feels real. 1. Separate feelings from facts. When you're under pressure, feelings feel like truth. I feel behind. I feel abandoned. I feel incapable. I feel like quitting. But feelings are indicators, not verdicts. They signal internal weather, not permanent reality. Standing firm begins with this simple discipline. Pause and ask, what are the facts? Feelings say, you're failing. Facts say, you're progressing, just slowly. Feelings say, you're alone. Facts say, you have support, you just feel disconnected. Feelings say, this will never change. Facts say, every season before this eventually shifted. You don't ignore feelings. You evaluate them. And when facts contradict fear, you anchor to facts. That's stability. 2. Control your inputs. Your mind is under attack? Then guard what enters it. You cannot consume anxiety all day and expect peace at night. You cannot scroll comparison for hours and expect confidence. You cannot binge negativity and expect clarity. What you repeatedly feed grows stronger. Standing firm requires selective consumption. Limit voices that amplify fear. Reduce noise that triggers insecurity. Increase exposure to truth. Music matters. Conversations matter. Content matters. Environment matters. Guarding your mind isn't weakness. It's strategy. If the battlefield is your mind, then inputs are supply lines. Protect them. 3. Speak truth out loud. Internal correction is good. External declaration is powerful. When thoughts spiral silently, they gain momentum. When truth is spoken aloud, it interrupts the cycle. Say, this thought is not aligned with truth. I am not defined by this moment. This pressure does not mean defeat. I am growing, even if it feels heavy. There is something stabilizing about hearing your own voice declare alignment. Because warfare in the mind thrives in silence. Truth disrupts distortion. And sometimes your breakthrough begins with a sentence spoken in a quiet room. 4. Simplify your obedience. When everything feels heavy, don't try to win the whole war in one day. Win the next hour. Pray for 5 minutes. Read one passage. Take one disciplined action. Send one message. Complete one task. Standing firm is not about dramatic victories. It's about consistent small alignments. Overwhelm says, you have to fix everything. Wisdom says, just stay aligned today. Momentum returns through repetition, and repetition builds resilience. 5. Refuse isolation. This is crucial. When pressure increases, your instinct may be withdrawal. You feel misunderstood. You feel tired. You feel like explaining your mental battle would be exhausting. But isolation amplifies distortion. Standing firm often requires connection. Talk to someone grounded. Confide in someone stable. Be honest about the pressure. You don't need a crowd. You need one solid voice that can reflect truth back to you when your mind feels foggy. Strength grows in community, even quiet community. 6. Remember past victories. Your mind under attack will conveniently forget your history of survival. It will act like this is the first hard season you've faced. It isn't. You've been here before, maybe not in the same way, but in the same intensity. And you didn't collapse. You grew. You adapted. You matured. You strengthened. Standing firm means recalling evidence. Make a mental list. Seasons you thought would break you. Moments you thought you couldn't handle. Decisions you were afraid to make. And yet, here you are. The same God who sustained you then has not disappeared now. Memory stabilizes perspective. 7. Don't fight alone, but don't fight emotionally. Spiritual battles are not won by panic. They are won by posture. Calm, anchored, deliberate posture. When you react emotionally, you exhaust yourself. When you respond strategically, you conserve strength. You don't need to scream at the darkness. You need to stay aligned in the light. Stand firm by remaining consistent, not reactive. The enemy wants drama. He wants you impulsive. He wants you quitting out of emotion. Standing firm denies him that reaction. You don't collapse. You don't lash out. You don't retreat. You stay steady. And steadiness is power. 8. Accept that strength feels heavy at first. You think strength feels like confidence. Sometimes it does. But often, strength feels like endurance. It feels like carrying weight without applause. It feels like resisting thoughts without recognition. It feels like fighting battles no one sees. Heavy doesn't mean losing. Heavy means you're lifting something. And lifting builds capacity. If it feels heavy lately, maybe your strength is increasing. And increased strength always begins with strain. Here's the deeper truth. Standing firm doesn't eliminate the battle immediately. It outlasts it. Storms lose energy. Waves lose force. Resistance weakens when it doesn't get reaction. Consistency exhausts opposition. If you remain aligned long enough, the pressure shifts. Not because you panicked. Not because you ran. Because you endured. And endurance rewires you. You become less reactive. Less fragile. Less easily shaken. The very season meant to destabilize you builds unshakable footing. So when it feels heavy, don't interpret heaviness as failure. Interpret it as weight training. You are being conditioned. And conditioning always feels harder before it feels empowering. Stand firm. Not perfectly. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Just steadily. Because steady people outlast storms. And storms were never permanent. They just feel intense while you're inside them. Hold your ground. This pressure does not define you. It is shaping you. Let's zoom out. Not from your problems. Not from your pressure. From the whole battlefield. Because when you're inside the war, everything feels urgent. Everything feels amplified. Everything feels like it might collapse at any second. But wars are not judged by single moments. They are judged by outcomes. And right now, you are measuring your life by moments. A bad week. A heavy month. A discouraging thought. An emotional dip. You're interpreting temporary turbulence as permanent defeat. But this is not defeat. This is resistance. And resistance only exists where something valuable is advancing. You need to understand something clearly. You are not under attack because you're weak. You're under attack because you're moving. Because stagnation doesn't threaten anything. Growth does. The enemy does not waste time on people who are spiritually asleep. He targets those who are waking up. He pressures those who are stepping forward. He distracts those who are gaining focus. He accuses those who are learning authority. This is war. But war does not mean loss. It means significance. If there were nothing at stake, there would be no battle. And if there were no future attached to you, there would be no resistance around you. The very intensity you feel is evidence of impact. Zoom out further. Every previous season that felt unbearable eventually became part of your testimony. Every night you thought would break you eventually turned into strength. Every delay you thought was denial became preparation. Every silent season deepened you. You survived storms you once believed would end you. Why would this one be different? Right now, your emotions are loud, but your history is louder. Your survival record is undefeated. You are still here, still breathing, still growing, still fighting. That is not the profile of someone losing. That is the profile of someone being refined. War is chaotic up close, but strategic from above. And you are not fighting alone. Even when it feels isolated. Even when the mind feels noisy. Even when heaven feels quiet. Silence does not mean absence. Pressure does not mean abandonment. Heaviness does not mean defeat. It means you are in the middle of something. And middle seasons always feel messy. No movie looks impressive halfway through. It's confusing, tense, unresolved. But the ending reframes everything. And you are not at the end. You are in the process. The war in your mind. It's not proof you're collapsing. It's proof you're transforming. Because the old version of you is being challenged. The smaller mindset is being confronted. The fragile identity is being rebuilt. And rebuilding feels disruptive. But disruption is not destruction. It's construction. You are not being dismantled. You are being upgraded. And upgrades require tension. Let's say this clearly. You are not crazy for feeling this. You are not weak for struggling internally. You are not faithless because doubt showed up. You are human in a battle. But you are not powerless in it. You have truth. You have awareness. You have history. You have growth. You have resilience forming in real time. And resilience is louder than fear. One day you will look back at this season and realize, the pressure didn't stop me. The doubt didn't silence me. The heaviness didn't break me. It built me. This is war. But you are not losing. You are learning how to stand. You are learning how to guard your mind. You are learning how to separate feelings from truth. You are learning how to remain steady under pressure. And steady people become dangerous because they cannot be easily shaken. Right now, the battle feels intense because your influence is expanding. Right now, the weight feels heavy because your capacity is increasing. Right now, the attack feels personal because your identity is strengthening. And strengthened identity changes everything. So don't misinterpret the war. It's not a sign to retreat. It's a sign to anchor. You don't need dramatic victory today. You need quiet endurance. One aligned thought. One disciplined choice. One steady step. That's how wars are won. Not with emotional spikes, but with sustained posture. And you are still standing. If you're still standing, you're not losing. If you're still choosing growth, you're not losing. If you're still seeking truth in the middle of pressure, you're not losing. This is not the end of your story. It's the forging of your strength. So lift your head, guard your mind, stabilize your footing, because this is war. But you are not losing.